She walked into the courtroom with nothing but hope in her heart, and bruises hidden beneath her sleeve. A mother, a fighter, and a woman who believed justice still existed. But what happened next silenced the entire room. In front of cameras, officers sworn to protect the law turned their hands against her. The sound of that slap echoed louder than any gavel, a reminder of how easily power can crush dignity. People gasped. Some looked away. Others recorded, as if capturing proof that justice had lost its way. But no one could have imagined what would happen just moments later, when the same woman they tried to humiliate walked back into that courtroom, not as a victim, but as the one everyone would soon stand for. Because sometimes, fate doesn't wait for permission, it strikes back in the most unexpected way. This is not just her story. It's a story about power, pain, and the day a woman turned injustice into redemption. Would you have believed it, if you hadn't seen it with your own eyes? It was supposed to be another quiet morning in Atlanta, the kind where sunlight filters through blinds and the city hums softly with routine. Danielle Brooks had her coffee just the way she liked it, dark, no sugar, no cream. A small ritual that started every day before work. She wasn't rich, famous, or powerful. Just a paralegal, the kind of woman who did the unseen work that helped lawyers win cases. Her life revolved around early mornings, long hours, and a quiet determination to build something better for her 8-year-old son, Micah. They lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment, the walls covered with his school drawings and motivational quotes she'd written to remind herself that even struggle had purpose. Danielle had seen enough of the world to know how easily it could turn on someone like her, a black woman with ambition. But she didn't let that fear run her life. She smiled through exhaustion, fought through whispers, and kept moving forward. That morning, as she walked to her car, her phone buzzed, another reminder about her upcoming certification exam. Passing it would mean a step closer to her dream, becoming a legal consultant. She had studied for months, often falling asleep over her textbooks. Today, she was scheduled to assist in one of the city's biggest civil rights cases, a lawsuit that had quietly shaken the police department. The irony wasn't lost on her. The case was about racial discrimination within law enforcement, something she had witnessed far too often but never from this close. Her boss, Attorney Harris, had trusted her with critical documents for the hearing. It was a chance to prove her worth, to be seen not just as an assistant, but as a voice that mattered. She got to the courthouse early. The marble floors reflected the morning light, and the air carried the weight of authority. Lawyers hurried past with files pressed against their chests. Officers stood by the doors, their eyes scanning everyone who entered. Danielle straightened her blazer, adjusted her badge, and reminded herself, "You belong here." But belonging, she'd learned, wasn't something you were always granted. Sometimes, it had to be fought for. Inside the courtroom, she found her seat in the second row. The plaintiff, a young black man, sat nervously at the front, his hands trembling slightly. Across the room, uniformed officers whispered to each other, their smirks thinly veiled. The judge hadn't arrived yet, but tension already filled the air. As the minutes passed, Danielle reviewed her notes. She could feel eyes on her, not curious eyes, but assessing ones. She was used to that look, the one that asked silently, "Why is she here?" Then, a small moment changed everything. She noticed a file missing, one she had placed in the evidence binder the night before. It wasn't just any file, it contained key witness statements that could turn the case. Her heart began to race. She searched her bag, her desk, even under the bench. Nothing. When she informed Officer Rayner, the deputy assigned to court duty, his smirk widened. "Maybe you misplaced it," he said flatly, his tone more accusation than help. Danielle's gut told her something was wrong. But before she could explain further, 2 officers approached her. "Ma'am, we need you to step outside." Confused, she followed. The hallway was empty except for a few officers standing near the entrance. One of them spoke quietly into his radio, then turned to her. "We've been informed of a possible breach of evidence. You'll need to come with us." Her hands trembled. "I work here," she said softly. "That's my badge, ask my supervisor." But her words fell into silence. The officers didn't ask. They didn't check. They just acted. One reached for her arm. The other blocked her path. Panic flickered across her face, not because of what they said, but because of how easily they dismissed her humanity. In that moment, she wasn't Danielle Brooks, paralegal, mother, professional. She was just another suspect. The coldness of their grip, the authority in their tone, it all felt too familiar. Generations of stories, protests, and prayers flashed in her mind. She had studied the law, believed in justice, but now she was standing in the middle of its hypocrisy. Inside the courtroom, voices rose. Someone tried to intervene, but the officers didn't stop. They pulled her closer to the door, her papers scattering across the polished floor. The echo of her heels, the sound of shuffling feet, and the distant murmur of confusion, it all blurred into one haunting moment. A moment she'd remember forever. And then, the unthinkable happened. In front of the very walls that symbolized fairness and order, an officer, uniform crisp, face expressionless, struck her. The room fell silent. The sound cracked through the air like a thunderclap. Danielle froze. The world seemed to pause. Somewhere, a phone began recording. Somewhere else, someone gasped. But all she could hear was the dull ringing in her ears and the burning sting across her face. For a second, she didn't move. She didn't cry. She just stood there, her dignity bleeding into the silence. They led her out, handcuffed, humiliated, under the same flag that promised liberty and justice for all. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that this moment of cruelty would ignite something far greater than anyone expected. Because the woman they tried to silence was about to become the voice the system couldn't ignore. And the same courtroom that had witnessed her pain would soon witness her power. But that moment hadn't come yet. For now, all that existed was the sting of injustice, and the quiet determination of a woman who refused to be erased. Her story wasn't just beginning. It was already rewriting history, one bruise, one headline, one act of defiance at a time. Because sometimes the ones they try to break, become the ones who change everything. The moment the officer's hand struck her, time fractured into silence. Danielle couldn't even feel her own breath. Around her, gasps rippled through the courtroom like a wave breaking against stone. Somewhere in the distance, someone shouted her name, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos that followed. Her cheek burned, not just from pain, but from humiliation. She had dedicated her life to the justice system, only to be broken by it in front of dozens of witnesses. Cameras rolled. Phones were raised. But no one stepped forward. Not yet. She was led out, her wrists bound, head down, not because of guilt, but because of disbelief. The echo of her own footsteps down the marble hallway sounded like a verdict. Each step reminded her that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how clean her record, her skin color could erase everything in seconds. In the holding area, the fluorescent lights buzzed above her. Cold metal pressed against her wrists. The officers exchanged quiet laughter, the kind that told her this wasn't new to them, this was routine. One officer muttered, "Guess she thought she was one of us." Another snickered, "She'll learn now." She didn't respond. Words wouldn't matter here. In this room, silence was the only armor she had left. Hours passed before she was released. There was no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the cameras that had caught every second of her assault. Just a folded report and the warning tone of, "You can go now." When she walked out of the precinct, her blazer was wrinkled, her dignity bruised. But something inside her had shifted. The Danielle who had once believed in quiet resilience now felt something heavier, something raw. That night, she sat on her couch, her son asleep in the next room. The city lights blinked through the blinds like restless eyes. On her phone, her name was already trending. Videos of the incident had spread like wildfire, hashtags, outrage, and disbelief filled the screen. But as she scrolled through the comments, she saw the split that defined every modern injustice. Some cried for accountability. Others justified it. "We don't know what she did. There must be more to the story. Maybe she resisted." The same words she had seen before. The same excuses that kept repeating like a broken record. And then, a knock at the door. Danielle hesitated. It was nearly midnight. She peered through the peephole and saw a familiar face, Attorney Harris, her boss. His eyes were heavy with concern. He stepped in without a word, placing a file on the table. "Danielle, they're claiming you tampered with evidence." Her heart sank. "That's impossible." "I know," he said softly. "But they're using it to cover their actions. They're saying the confrontation started because you refused to cooperate during questioning." Danielle clenched her fists. "They hit me in a courtroom." "I know," he repeated, his tone breaking. "And that's why this won't go away quietly." He explained that an internal investigation had already begun, not into the officers, but into her. They were painting her as unstable, emotional, and unprofessional. It was a strategy she recognized well: destroy the credibility, then dismiss the truth. But what they didn't know was that Danielle wasn't alone anymore. The footage had caught everything: the slap, the fall, the silence. And the internet wasn't letting it go. Within days, protests began forming outside the courthouse. Signs filled the air: "Justice for Danielle. No more silence. Accountability now." Yet with every chant, the system pushed back harder. Emails flooded her inbox, threats disguised as warnings. Anonymous messages told her to drop it, to move on before it gets worse. Her workplace put her on temporary leave for her own safety. News outlets twisted the story, some calling her a victim, others hinting she provoked it. But behind all that noise, something deeper was stirring. Civil rights groups reached out. Former colleagues offered to testify. Even the city's mayor, under growing public pressure, released a statement promising a thorough review. Danielle stayed quiet through it all. Not because she was afraid, but because she was planning. Each night, she gathered every document, every message, every piece of proof. She knew how fragile truth could be once lawyers started twisting it. She would not let her story become another footnote in the long history of forgotten names. Then came the day that would change everything again. The city scheduled a hearing, not for her assault, but for the administrative review of her conduct. The irony burned. The same courtroom where she was struck would now judge whether she was at fault. The morning of the hearing, rain poured like a warning. Reporters lined the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as Danielle stepped out of the car, her chin lifted, her eyes steady. She wore the same blazer from that day, pressed, repaired, a quiet act of defiance. The bruise had faded, but the memory hadn't. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The same officers were there, crisp uniforms, unreadable faces. The same walls, the same judge's bench. But this time, the silence belonged to her. As proceedings began, the panel questioned her tone, her behavior, her professionalism. Not one asked why an unarmed woman was assaulted by men in uniform. Not one mentioned the footage until her lawyer brought it up. And when the clip played on the courtroom screen, the slap, the collective gasp, the stunned stillness, something shifted in the room. The officers avoided eye contact. The judge cleared his throat. The audience whispered. For the first time, power trembled. But the fight was far from over. After the hearing, a leak emerged, internal emails showing that officials had coordinated to suppress the video before it went public. The revelation spread faster than any statement they could issue. Public outrage ignited. Protesters filled the courthouse square day after day. People from every background, students, lawyers, nurses, mothers, stood with signs bearing her name. What started as one woman's pain was now a city's reckoning. Yet, even as the movement grew, the threats intensified. Late-night calls. Cars slowing near her home. Anonymous letters slipped under her door. Fear began to creep in like smoke, invisible, suffocating. One night, she found her car windows smashed, her tires slashed. On the windshield, written in red marker, "Know your place." She stood there in the rain, staring at the message. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed down, the exhaustion, the fear, the loneliness. But then she remembered Micah's face. His laughter. His belief that his mother was brave. And suddenly, quitting wasn't an option. In the days that followed, Danielle filed her own lawsuit, not just against the officers, but against the entire department and the court system that enabled them. Her case became a national headline. Major networks debated her every move. Social media split again, between those who demanded justice and those who wanted her silenced. Still, she spoke. Not with anger, but with truth. She began attending rallies, speaking at universities, sharing her story with quiet strength. "I didn't ask to become a symbol," she said once. "But if my pain can make the system look at itself, then maybe it was worth it." As months passed, the investigation widened. The officers involved were suspended, one quietly resigned. But behind closed doors, powerful figures scrambled to contain the fallout. The more they tried to bury her case, the louder it became. Then, one morning, she received a letter, an official summons. The State Judiciary Committee had scheduled a public ethics hearing. Not for her this time, but for the judge who had stood silent as she was assaulted in his courtroom. The irony was poetic. The very walls that had once seen her humiliation would now see accountability unfold. The hearing drew national attention. Every major outlet broadcast it live. The courtroom was packed, activists, journalists, families. Danielle sat in the front row, her hands clasped, her heart pounding. When the judge entered, he avoided her gaze. His robe, once a symbol of authority, now looked like a shadow of its former power. As testimonies began, officers contradicted each other. Records were exposed, showing cover-ups and missing reports. The truth unraveled thread by thread until there was nowhere left to hide. By the end of the week, the committee reached its decision. The judge was removed from office for misconduct. The officers faced federal charges. But the most unexpected moment came weeks later. The city's Judicial Review Board extended an offer to Danielle, an interim appointment as Community Justice Advisor, a position designed to reform courtroom ethics and racial accountability. When she walked into the courthouse again, reporters lined the halls. Cameras flashed, but this time, no one whispered in judgment. They whispered in awe. The same courtroom that had once been her undoing now welcomed her back, as an equal. As a leader. And as she stood there, in front of the same bench where her pain began, something inside her settled. Not peace, that would take time, but purpose. Because justice isn't born in silence. It grows from the voices that refuse to disappear. Danielle didn't take the judge's seat out of revenge. She took it as a reminder that power, when used right, could heal what it once destroyed. Outside, the crowds cheered her name. Signs waved in the air. Somewhere in the noise, she heard Micah's voice calling, "That's my mom." For a moment, she closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. The world had tried to define her by one moment of pain. But she had rewritten it, turned humiliation into hope, despair into reform. And though the scars remained, they had become her armor. Because sometimes, the ones they push to the ground, are the ones who rise high enough to change the view for everyone else. And this time, no one would ever forget her name again. The morning of the final hearing arrived like the calm before a storm, deceptively quiet, almost sacred in its stillness. The courthouse stood beneath an overcast sky, the marble steps glistening from the night's rain. Reporters gathered in clusters, microphones poised, their voices buzzing through the damp air. It was a day the city would remember, a day when justice would be forced to look itself in the mirror. Inside, the courtroom was filled beyond capacity. Protesters, law students, community leaders, all had come to witness the moment that had been months in the making. The case that began with a single slap had grown into something far larger, a movement that questioned the very foundation of fairness itself. Danielle Brooks walked through the heavy wooden doors with her heart steady, but her palms trembling. Every step echoed with ghosts of that day, the laughter of the officers, the sting of that strike, the silence of a room that had watched and done nothing. She took her seat, wearing a dark navy suit, her mother's silver cross around her neck. It wasn't armor, but it felt like one. In the front row, Micah sat beside her sister, clutching a small sign that read, "Justice for All." His wide eyes watched his mother, unaware of the magnitude of what she was carrying, not just her own pain, but generations of voices silenced before her. The judge presiding over this final hearing wasn't the same one from before. This was Judge Miriam Tate, known for her integrity and refusal to bend under political pressure. Her presence alone brought a kind of stillness to the room. She looked at Danielle not as a defendant, not even as a plaintiff, but as a human being. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The crowd stood, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Tate adjusted her glasses, looked down at the documents before her, then slowly scanned the room. "Before we begin," she said, her voice firm but calm, "let it be clear that this hearing is not merely about one woman. It is about the system that allowed such acts to go unchallenged for so long." A murmur rippled through the audience. Camera zoomed in. Across the aisle, the officers sat with their legal counsel, rigid, emotionless, rehearsed. But beneath their stoic faces, there was something else, a quiet fear. The prosecution began with evidence, the same footage the world had already seen, but this time in full, unedited, uncut. On the screen, the moment replayed in slow motion, Danielle standing, confused but calm, the officers approaching, the sudden motion of an arm, and then, the slap. The sound, even through the speakers, made people flinch. Some looked away. Others wiped their eyes. Then came the part no one had seen, the body cam footage that had been withheld for months. It captured the moments before the assault. "Do we really need her in here?" one officer's voice said quietly. "She's just a paralegal," another responded. "Thinks she owns the place." And then, laughter. Cruel, careless laughter. The courtroom gasped. Danielle sat still, her eyes fixed on the screen, her face unreadable. Inside, her heart pounded, not out of rage, but relief. The truth, finally, was speaking for itself. When the footage ended, the defense tried to spin the narrative, claiming confusion, claiming procedural miscommunication. But the room had already made up its mind. You could feel it, that slow shift when the lie collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. Still, the defense had one more card to play. One of the officers, Sergeant Cole, requested to testify. He walked up, head bowed slightly, eyes shifting between Danielle and the judge. His voice was low. "I've served 20 years, he began, "and I've seen this department do things I'm not proud of. What happened that day, it wasn't protocol. It wasn't justice. It was power, and we all let it happen." A gasp. Whispers erupted in the audience. Even Danielle's lawyer turned toward him in disbelief. Cole continued, his hands shaking slightly. "After it happened, I was told to stay quiet. We were all told to. Reports were rewritten. Footage was deleted. They said it would protect the department, that she'd move on." He paused, swallowing hard. But she didn't. And thank God she didn't. Judge Tate leaned forward. "Are you saying there was a coordinated effort to conceal evidence?" "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "By higher-ups. They wanted her gone, her reputation ruined. Because the truth scared them." For the first time, Danielle exhaled. Her eyes closed briefly, as if releasing months of held breath. The courtroom erupted, reporters rushing to type, audience members standing in shock. The bailiff called for order, but it was impossible to contain the energy that had just flooded the room. And then, just as quickly, the mood shifted again. The defense attorney stood. "Your Honor," he said sharply, "these claims are unverified. We request a recess." Judge Tate denied it immediately. "Not today," she said firmly. "Today, the truth will not wait another moment." The hearing continued for hours. Evidence after evidence. Testimony after testimony. Each revelation peeled back another layer of corruption, and each one brought the city closer to an uncomfortable truth: justice wasn't blind. It was selective. By the time the sun began to set outside, the courtroom lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the faces of those present. The final witness had spoken. The final defense had failed. Judge Tate announced a short recess before delivering her ruling. Danielle stepped outside into the hallway, leaning against the wall, her body trembling from exhaustion. The crowd around her parted as people approached, some strangers, some friends, all thanking her, hugging her, telling her she had done something extraordinary. But she barely heard them. Her mind was elsewhere, back to that moment months ago when she stood alone, handcuffed, wondering if her life had just ended. Now she stood here, at the edge of something bigger, not victory, but vindication. She looked down the hallway and saw a familiar figure, Sergeant Cole. Their eyes met. For a second, neither spoke. Then he nodded slightly, a gesture of remorse and respect. Before she could respond, the bailiff's voice echoed again. Court is back in session. Everyone filed back in. The air was electric now, charged with anticipation. Judge Tate returned to the bench. Her expression was firm, her voice unwavering. I have reviewed every document, every piece of footage, and every testimony presented before this court, she began. What I have seen is not only a violation of law, but a betrayal of humanity. She paused. You could hear the hum of the ceiling lights, the creak of chairs, the faint heartbeat of an entire city waiting. This court finds the officers guilty of misconduct, unlawful assault, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The room exploded in sound. Reporters shouted. People cried. Danielle's hands covered her face, tears streaming freely now. Micah jumped from his seat, clapping before anyone could stop him. But Judge Tate wasn't finished. This ruling, she continued, is not just a punishment. It is a message that no badge, no title, and no courtroom stands above accountability. And to Ms. Danielle Brooks, she turned toward her, you have reminded this nation that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to be silent in its presence. The crowd stood in ovation. Cameras flashed. Danielle rose slowly, trembling but tall. For the first time since that slap, she smiled, not from joy, but from release. As the gavel struck, she felt the weight of it all. Every bruise, every night of doubt, every whispered threat, turned into something else entirely. Not pain. Not pride. But power. The hearing adjourned. Outside, as she stepped into the evening air, the sky broke open, golden light streaming through dark clouds, like the city itself was finally exhaling. People surrounded her, chanting her name. She could barely make her way through the crowd, but she didn't mind. This noise, this chaos, it wasn't fear anymore. It was freedom. Then, amid the sea of voices, one figure stood apart, an older woman holding a small, handwritten sign. It read, "For my daughter, who never got her justice." Their eyes met. No words passed between them. But the message was clear, this moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to every woman who had been silenced, every name that had been erased. Danielle walked down the steps, her heels clicking against the stone, every step echoing through history. The cameras followed, but for once, she didn't feel watched, she felt seen. As she reached the bottom, Micah ran into her arms. She lifted him high, tears falling freely now. "Did we win, Mom?" he whispered. She smiled, pressing her forehead to his. "We didn't just win," she said softly. "We changed something." Behind them, the courthouse glowed in the fading light, a monument to justice reborn. But even in victory, Danielle knew the fight wasn't over. It never truly was. Because for every story that ends in redemption, there are hundreds still waiting in silence. And that's when she made a decision, one that would turn her personal battle into a national mission. As the chants echoed, as the crowd swelled, she turned back toward the courthouse steps and spoke into the microphones thrust toward her. Her voice, steady and sure, carried across the plaza. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about every person who's ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or wait their turn for justice. We've waited long enough." The crowd erupted again, their cheers rising like thunder. And in that moment, standing where she once fell, Danielle Brooks didn't just reclaim her dignity. She redefined what justice could look like. Because sometimes, the moment they try to break you, becomes the moment you make history. And the world was finally listening. The courtroom was silent. The same room that once echoed with the sound of humiliation now stood still in awe. She sat there, calm, composed, unbroken, behind the judge's bench. The light from the tall windows fell across her face, not as a witness or a victim anymore, but as the one delivering justice. Years had passed since that day when the officers had slapped her to the ground, a moment that went viral, a moment the world tried to explain away. They called it a misunderstanding, a lapse in protocol, an unfortunate incident. But for her, it wasn't just a moment. It was a wound. One that bled into every sleepless night, every courtroom she walked into as a law student, every barrier she faced as a black woman chasing the very system that once silenced her. She remembered the whispers, "She'll never make it." The stares that told her she didn't belong. The countless rejections, the quiet rooms where her name was left off lists she'd earned a place on. But she didn't stop. Because deep down, she knew her pain had a purpose, and that justice, no matter how long it took, would one day wear her face. And now, that day had come. When she took her seat, the same officers who once struck her were ordered to stand before her, not as protectors, but as defendants. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The cameras that once captured her humiliation were now focused on her triumph. But this wasn't revenge. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to break them down the way they tried to break her. Instead, she let the law, the same law that failed her, speak through her voice. Calm. Clear. Controlled. The same voice they once silenced now carried the weight of justice. And when she looked them in the eyes, she didn't see power or fear, she saw accountability. She saw the truth that no slap, no badge, no courtroom could ever erase. Her verdict wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoration. About reclaiming something bigger, dignity. When the gavel came down, it wasn't just the end of a case, it was the sound of history shifting, even if just a little. Outside the courthouse, people waited, faces full of pride, hope, and disbelief. The same community that once marched for her now celebrated her. But amid the cheers and camera flashes, she stayed quiet. Because she knew this victory wasn't complete. For every woman like her who stood tall, there were countless others who couldn't. Who were silenced. Forgotten. Buried beneath statistics and excuses. And that's when she said it, the words that would echo across headlines and hearts. Justice isn't about power. It's about persistence. And today, we prove that even the most broken system can be made to listen, if we don't stop speaking. Her story spread across the country. Schools invited her to speak. Young girls wrote letters saying they wanted to be judges too. Activists quoted her speech in rallies. But the real change, the one that mattered, happened quietly. In living rooms. In classrooms. In the hearts of people who finally saw that courage could rise from pain. Because her story wasn't just hers, it was a reflection of every injustice hidden behind a uniform, every voice drowned out by authority, every person told to stay in their place. And as she stood on the courthouse steps, she looked up at the same sky she once cried under, the night after the slap, and smiled. Not because the world was suddenly fair, but because she had become the proof that it could be better. So, maybe the question isn't how she found justice. Maybe the real question is, will we keep fighting for it, or wait until another story like hers forces us to? Because one woman changed a courtroom. But together, we can change the world.